Sometime in the 2080s, a nuclear reactor sitting somewhere on the coast of China is going to require a scheduled physical delivery of highly refined uranium fuel just to keep the lights on in Guangdong.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the check for that specific delivery of uranium, the financial commitment that actually guarantees it will be mined, processed, and shipped, well, that was essentially written this morning.
It really was, yeah.
So if you're tracking energy, commodities, or the global supply chain, you have probably scrolled past the headline today. China just approved 8 new reactors. And this audio explainer breaks down exactly what those new reactor approvals mean for uranium demand, fuel supply, and, long-term market tightness.
Exactly.
Because if you follow nuclear energy or commodities, this is the faster way to understand the real market angle without having to read the full, dense reports. We're building this deep dive directly from the source material to give you the key takeaways, the hidden implications, and the investor angle in a conversational format.
Right, because the human brain, it immediately visualizes the concrete, the cranes, the massive earth-moving equipment. It looks like a construction story.
It totally does. But today, we are going to look at the 160 billion to 170 billion RMB decision that just permanently altered the global energy market.
Yeah.
We are looking at a multi-decade fuel squeeze that is happening right under our noses.
I think the visual of the cranes actually distracts from the permanent financial reality here. Because, a construction project has an end date, right?
Sure.
The ribbons get cut, the scaffolding comes down, and the engineers go home. But the second you flip the switch on a gigawatt-class nuclear reactor, it transforms.
It becomes a consumer.
Exactly. It becomes an uncompromising, insatiable consumer of a very specific, highly refined global commodity. When Beijing greenlights a new batch of reactors, they are not just authorizing a building.
Right. They are basically legally and physically locking their grid into a relentless demand cycle for the next, 60 to 80 years.
Yeah, easily 60 to 80 years. So the building itself is really just the entry fee. To figure out the actual cost of the subscription, we need to completely shift our perspective away from the concrete being poured and redirect it toward the uranium being mined.
Okay, let's physically map out what just happened in the sources we've gathered. We are looking at 8 new units, right? Divided up into pairs.
Yep, 2 units each.
Across 4 distinct coastal provinces. We've got Zhejiang, Guangdong, Liaoning, and Shandong. And the reports put this at a capital deployment of somewhere between 160 billion and over 170 billion RMB.
And you really have to look at the geography of those 4 provinces. These aren't remote outposts in the middle of nowhere.
No, not at all.
These are the absolute nerve centers of Chinese manufacturing and heavy industry. By dropping dual reactor configurations directly into these specific coastal grids, they are systematically embedding massive uninterrupted baseload power directly into their economic engines.
They're physically anchoring their future GDP growth to nuclear fission. But the scale of that capital deployment, the 170 billion RMB, that's what I keep getting stuck on. Because, think about how infrastructure works in the West.
Oh, it's night and day.
Right. Trying to get a single subway extension funded, permitted, and broken ground on is a multi-decade political nightmare. Getting one new airport terminal can take 15 years.
Just the environmental reviews alone take a decade.
Exactly. So to see a single, coordinated financial package of this magnitude deployed across 4 different geographical sites simultaneously, it's almost alien to a Western observer.
It really represents a completely different paradigm of capital deployment. We're looking at absolute unified state commitment. But here's the thing you have to realize. Those 8 reactors aren't happening in isolation.
Right, they're just the newest addition.
Exactly. To understand the sheer gravity of this, you have to place those 8 units on top of the existing baseline. As of mid-2026, the Chinese grid is running roughly 62 gigawatts of operational nuclear capacity.
Okay, 62 gigawatts. And the stated public goal from the source material is to hit roughly 110 gigawatts by the year 2030.
Yep.
Closing a gap of almost 50 gigawatts in less than 4 years, that sounds mathematically impossible if you were just starting now.
Well, the trick is they aren't starting now. You have to look at what is already in the dirt.
Okay.
There are currently 39 reactors actively under construction.
Wow. 39.
Yeah. So when you take the 62 gigawatts already powering the grid and you add the staggering output of those 39 reactors currently being built, and then you pile these 8 newly approved units on top of the pile.
The funnel isn't just wide, it's continuously expanding.
It's massively expanding. They are stacking these annual multi-unit approvals to aggressively bridge that gap to 110 gigawatts.
Okay, I have to stop you there and just push back on the physical reality of this for a second. Because managing 39 concurrent nuclear reactor builds across a country and then slapping 8 more onto the drawing board, I mean, that sounds like a recipe for a catastrophic supply chain bottleneck.
It does sound like that, yeah.
Because historically, right, nuclear construction is practically famous for delays, cost overruns, and engineering disasters.
Yeah.
You can't just treat a nuclear core like a Honda Civic on an assembly line.
Wow.
You still have unique seismic zones, different coastal water temperatures for cooling, distinct soil compositions.
Yeah.
How are they standardizing something that legally and physically requires site-specific engineering?
So here is what's fascinating here, and what the reports really emphasize. You isolate the core technology from the site-specific variables. The magic here, and the reason they can juggle 39 concurrent builds without the whole thing collapsing, is their total reliance on domestically developed third-generation designs.
Right. Sources specifically mention the Hualong 1 and the CP1000.
Exactly. What they have done is strip away the bespoke, custom-engineered mindset that basically plagued Western nuclear builds for decades.
Right.
In the past, a utility in the US or Europe would treat a new plant as a unique monument. Every valve, every pipe run, every single control room layout was slightly different.
Which means every time you encounter a problem, it's a brand new problem that requires a custom engineering solution. And that halts construction for 6 months while they figure it out.
Precisely the opposite of the Hualong 1 approach. They took the nuclear island, the reactor pressure vessel, the steam generators, the primary cooling loops, and they froze the design.
They lock it in.
They turned it into a repeatable modular manufacturing process. Now, yes, the outer containment shell or the cooling intake might need slight modifications for a specific coastal water temperature in Guangdong versus Liaoning, but the internal machinery, it is identical.
Oh, wow. So the factories forging the steel for the reactor vessels are just churning out the exact same shape over and over.
Yes, the metallurgical forges, the pipe fitters, the welders, they performing the exact same tasks they did on the last build. When a crew finishes pouring the foundation for a Hualong 1 in Zhejiang, they can travel to Shandong and look at the exact same blueprints.
The institutional memory compounds, the supply chain learns.
Exactly. The labor force achieves a rhythm. That rapid, standardized replication is literally the only physical way a nation targets 110 gigawatts without collapsing its own engineering sector.
Okay, so they figured out how to mass produce the hardware. But this is where the narrative shifts, I think, from an infrastructure marvel to a looming commodity squeeze. Because building a standardized reactor is an incredible feat, but now you have to feed it.
Yeah, and feeding a reactor is not a one-time purchase. It is the ultimate recurring subscription model.
Right.
And the fuel cycle is brutally unforgiving.
I want to use a specific analogy here to visualize what this demand looks like, because I don't think people always grasp how uranium actually moves through the market.
Okay.
A lot of folks use the printer and ink analogy. The reactor is the printer, the uranium is the ink.
Which is fine, but it's a bit too static.
Right, it's too static. I prefer looking at the supply chain like a python eating a pig.
Okay, I like that.
The pig is this massive, newly approved batch of 8 reactors. When that demand enters the system, it doesn't just disappear. You can watch that massive lump slowly stretch and strain every single physical segment of the supply chain over a period of years before a single watt of electricity is ever generated.
That is a much more accurate visualization of the physical bottlenecks, yeah.
Yeah.
Because the nuclear fuel cycle is incredibly layered. You don't just dig a rock out of a mine in Namibia and throw it into a Hualong 1 reactor.
Exactly. So let's actually walk through the physical reality of that python for you, the listener, based on the market analysis we're reviewing. What happens at the very beginning of the supply chain?
Well, first you have the mining of natural uranium, which is often referred to as yellowcake. But yellowcake is literally a heavy, powdery substance. It is completely useless to a commercial reactor in that state.
Because it's not potent enough, right?
Right. The concentration of the fissile isotope, uranium-235, is only about 0.7% in yellowcake. A Hualong 1 reactor needs fuel enriched to around 4 or 5%.
Okay, so you have this dense yellow powder. How do you get it from 0.7 to 5%? I mean, you can't just sift it through a screen.
No, you have to fundamentally change its state of matter. So the yellow cake is shipped to a conversion facility. This is the second major bottleneck in the Python. Through a highly complex chemical process, that solid powder is converted into uranium hexafluoride, or UF6, which is actually a gas.
Wait, a gas. So we've gone from mining a solid rock, crushing it into a powder, and now we've chemically transformed it into a gas.
Yep, because you can't spin a powder at supersonic speeds.
Oh, okay.
The UF6 gas is then shipped in these specialized cylinders to an enrichment facility. And this is the third and arguably the most technically restrictive bottleneck in the whole world. The gas is fed into massive cascades of centrifuges that spin at just mind-boggling speeds.
Then what does that spinning actually do?
Well, the slightly heavier uranium-238 isotopes are pushed to the outside of the centrifuge, and the lighter uranium-235 isotopes collect near the center. You siphon off that center gas, run it through thousands of centrifuges in sequence, and slowly, painstakingly build up that concentration to the 4 or 5% required.
Wow.
And that resulting product is called EUP, enriched uranium product.
Okay, but even then, even with this EUP, you still don't have something you can physically put in a reactor, right?
Right.
Because it's still a gas.
Exactly. You can't put a gas in a reactor core. So the fourth and final bottleneck is fabrication.
Okay.
You take that enriched gas, you chemically convert it back into a solid uranium dioxide powder, you press that powder into small ceramic pellets, load those pellets into long zirconium alloy tubes, and then bundle those tubes together into a precise fuel assembly.
And that assembly is designed specifically for the Hualong one.
Yes.
Okay, so just to recap that journey mining. Conversion, enrichment, fabrication. 4 distinct, highly capital-intensive, geographically dispersed bottlenecks. So when China announces 8 new reactors, they aren't just putting a strain on the uranium miners.
Not at all.
That pig is going to stretch the conversion facilities, it's going to max out the enrichment centrifuges, and it's going to demand brand new fabrication lines.
And here is the truly terrifying part for anyone trying to source fuel for a competing grid anywhere else in the world. That demand doesn't just pass through the Python and disappear.
Right, because it's a subscription.
The Python just keeps getting longer. A modern third-generation reactor has an operational lifespan of 60 to 80 years. So the decision made in Beijing this week basically locks in a baseline draw on all 4 of those bottlenecks well into the 2080s.
The compounding math is just staggering when you think about it. I mean, every single year they approve a new batch. That massive lump of demand stacks on top of the demand from the 39 reactors currently under construction.
Which stacks on top of the 62 gigawatts already running.
Right, and you can't substitute the fuel.
No, you really can't. If the wind stops blowing, a turbine sits idle. If coal gets too expensive, a grid might burn natural gas for a while. But if a Hualong 1 reactor is running, it requires highly enriched uranium fuel assemblies. Period. There is no alternative.
Which means China cannot afford to wait until 2030 to figure out where their fuel is coming from. If the demand is locked in for 6 decades and the pipeline is expanding at a breakneck pace, they have to secure the supply right now.
And the data from our sources shows they are acting with intense, incredible urgency.
Yeah, let's follow the money here, because there is a massive financial signal hiding in plain sight in these reports. In 2025 alone, estimates show China spent $5.8 billion on nuclear fuel imports.
Yeah.
$5.8 billion in a single calendar year.
It's a record-breaking surge, but the raw dollar amount, honestly, is only half the story. The real signal is the composition of what they physically purchased with that $5.8 billion.
Okay, parse that out for us. What exactly did they buy?
They didn't just buy the raw yellow cake powder at the start of the Python. They bought across the entire spectrum we just described. They bought natural uranium, yes, but they also bought massive quantities of EUP, the enriched gas, and they bought fully fabricated fuel assemblies.
Okay, wait. Think about the logistical advantage of buying EUP. When China purchases enriched uranium product directly, they are entirely bypassing the mining bottleneck, the conversion bottleneck, and the enrichment bottleneck.
Exactly. They are buying time and guaranteed security.
But wait, if they have 62 gigawatts running today, does that baseline fleet actually require $5.8 billion worth of fuel in a single year to operate?
Not even close. It's
Yeah.
way more than they need for current operations.
No, why buy it?
When a state entity moves up the value chain to aggressively purchase enriched and fully fabricated fuel at record volumes like this, it indicates massive strategic stockpiling.
Oh.
They are looking at the 39 units under construction, They are looking at the 110 gigawatt target for 2030, and they are sweeping the global board of available material today to insulate themselves from the inevitable supply shocks of tomorrow.
Now, obviously, we're just objectively reviewing this stockpiling behavior as a rational market mechanism described in the sources. We're not taking any geopolitical sides here.
Right, it's just pure market mechanics.
But let's pause and talk about the physical reality of stockpiling this specific commodity. Because if you want to stockpile coal for a harsh winter, you need hundreds of acres of land, you need endless train cars, and you have to worry about the elements degrading the pile over time.
Right, rain, wind, all of it.
And if you want to stockpile natural gas, you need incredibly expensive pressurized cryogenic tanks, and you constantly lose a percentage to boil off.
Yeah, gas is notoriously hard to store long term.
So how do you physically stockpile $5.8 billion worth of nuclear fuel? I mean, the physical footprint must be insane.
Actually, that is the unique geopolitical advantage of uranium. Its energy density is simply incomparable to fossil fuels.
Okay.
A single uranium pellet the size of your fingertip contains the energy equivalent of roughly a ton of coal.
Wait, one fingertip-sized pellet?
Yes. So you can store years' worth of fabricated fuel assemblies for a gigawatt-class reactor inside a single, highly secure warehouse. It doesn't degrade, it doesn't evaporate, it just sits there, representing pure, stored baseload electricity.
That is wild. So pouring $5.8 billion into the market to build a strategic warehouse of ready-to-use fuel isn't just feasible, it's incredibly rational.
It is arguably the only responsible move for a nation that has anchored its economic future to 110 gigawatts of nuclear power. I mean, think about it. The capital sunk into the concrete of those plants is immense. Leaving those 170 billion RMB reactors stranded without fuel because of a bottleneck in conversion or enrichment somewhere else in the world, that would be an unforgivable failure of state planning.
Yeah, that makes total sense. But relying purely on open market purchases, even if you were stockpiling heavily, that still leaves you somewhat exposed, right?
It does, yes.
Because if the spot price of uranium doubles tomorrow, your $5.8 billion suddenly buys half as much fuel. A nation executing a multi-decade, 110 gigawatt rollout isn't going to just leave its survival up to the whims of the spot market.
No, they aren't. Which brings us to the structural architecture of their entire supply chain. What the sources are really highlighting is that they are transitioning from being a mere participant in the global market to being an owner of the global market.
Okay, let's examine the rule of thirds. This is a major point in the reports. This is basically the blueprint for their supply securitization. How does this policy actually manifest in the physical world?
The rule of thirds is a very calculated risk mitigation strategy designed to eliminate any single point of failure in that python. The first mandate is to source roughly 1/3 of their required uranium domestically from geological deposits within China's own borders.
Which guarantees a baseline of survival without ever having to cross an international border or sail a cargo ship.
Exactly, it's baseline security. The second mandate targets another 1/3 of the supply to come from overseas equity. And this is the crucial pivot for investors to understand.
Right.
They aren't just signing contracts to buy uranium from a foreign mining company. Chinese state-backed entities are purchasing the physical mines themselves.
So they're taking outright ownership of the dirt and the infrastructure. It's like a massive coffee chain deciding not to just buy beans on the open market, but actually buying up the coffee plantations in South America and Africa to guarantee their inventory.
That is a perfect analogy, yes. And the final third.
Yeah, what's the final third?
The final third is left to the open market, traditional spot purchases, and long-term contracts with international suppliers.
Okay, so to visualize the impact of this for you, the listener, imagine the global uranium supply as a massive reservoir that the whole world drinks from. For decades, Western utilities just assumed they could walk up to the reservoir with a bucket whenever they needed fuel.
Right, because there was always enough water.
But under this rule of thirds, China isn't just taking bigger buckets of the reservoir. They are systematically going upstream and buying the rivers that feed the reservoir, diverting the water directly to their own facilities before it ever even reaches the public pool.
That is exactly what is happening. Look at a physical map of global uranium deposits to see this in action. Down in Namibia, for instance, you have the Husab and Russing mines.
Okay.
These are not minor little side projects. They are massive Tier 1 global assets capable of moving the needle on worldwide supply. And China has aggressively stepped in and taken commanding equity ownership in those operations.
So let's trace the physical path of a pound of uranium mined at Husab today. If a Chinese state-owned enterprise owns the mine, Does that uranium ever get priced on the Western spot market? Does the utility in France or Illinois ever get the chance to bid on it?
Almost certainly not. That physical pound of yellowcake is extracted from the Namibian desert, loaded onto a ship, and sent directly into the Chinese conversion and enrichment infrastructure. It is entirely bypassed. It's removed from the global chessboard completely.
It becomes a closed-loop system.
Yes, and the strategy extends far beyond Namibia. The sources point out they are heavily engaged in Kazakhstan, which is actually the largest single producer of natural uranium in the world.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They are locking down Kazakh production through long-term partnerships. And furthermore, they are absorbing massive quantities of Russian-enriched uranium.
This creates a brutal zero-sum reality for the rest of the world. Because every time China locks down a long-term Kazakh contract, or buys a shipment of Russian EUP, or extracts a pound of yellowcake from their own mine in Namibia, the mathematical pool of available uranium for the rest of the globe just shrinks.
It shrinks. And remember, those Western utilities operating in Europe, the United States, and South Korea, they also have fleets of reactors that demand daily feeding.
Right. Their pythons are hungry, too.
Exactly. The python is stretching in the West, too. But the Western utilities do not have state-backed entities buying up mines in Africa to guarantee their baseline. They are still just walking up to the reservoir with a bucket.
Wow. So we are looking at a perfect storm of supply constraint here. We have a synchronized, standardized construction rollout happening at an unprecedented speed, utilizing identical Hualong 1 architecture. We have locked-in, inflexible demand that will persist into the 2080s. We have a verifiable $5.8 billion capital flight into aggressive stockpiling of ready-to-use fuel. And we have the systematic securitization of global supply lines through the rule of thirds, physically removing Tier 1 assets from the open market.
It is the complete systemic reshaping of the nuclear fuel landscape. There's no other way to put it.
So for the listener who is trying to make sense of this from a market perspective, what is the ultimate takeaway? How does this data fundamentally alter the thesis for uranium investors?
The data dictates that you can no longer view uranium through the lens of a cyclical commodity trade. China's infrastructure mandate is transforming nuclear power into a structural, multi-decade growth market.
Okay, let's clearly define the mechanics of that distinction. Because for the last 30 years, uranium has been the textbook definition of a boom and bust cyclical trade.
Right, it really has. In a traditional cyclical market, a brief supply shock causes the spot price to spike.
Right.
That high price suddenly incentivizes a flurry of wildcat exploration and the reopening of old marginal mines. Eventually, all that new supply floods the market, overshoots the actual demand, and the price collapses, which destroys the incentive to mine again.
Right.
Investors have historically treated uranium as a timing game, trying to catch the 18-month upswing and getting out before the inevitable crash.
But a structural growth market rewrites that gravity completely.
A structural market is driven by a permanent underlying shift in the demand floor that supersedes temporary supply gluts. China's 110 gigawatt target, backed by massive state capital and standardized manufacturing, represents that permanent shift.
So they aren't building these 39 reactors because uranium happens to be cheap today.
Not at all. They are building them because their grid absolutely demands the baseload power. They will buy the fuel regardless of whether the spot price is $50 a pound or $150 a pound.
The demand is completely price inelastic.
Exactly. And because that massive price inelastic demand is actively consuming the available global supply through those equity purchases and stockpiling we talked about, the market never gets the chance to experience a true oversupply bust.
Wow.
Higher long-term contract coverage becomes a matter of pure survival for Western utilities. If they don't lock in their fuel now, the material simply will not exist on the spot market 3 years from now because it's already been spoken for by the East.
This creates a fascinating dynamic for the physical producers of the fuel. The bull case seems heavily weighted toward developers who can bring new pounds out of the ground in this tightening environment. But there is a very specific geopolitical filter that applies here based on the reports, right?
Oh, absolutely. There is a massive premium placed on non-Russian Western-aligned supply.
Break down the mechanics of that premium for us. Why is a pound of uranium mined in Canada or the U.S. suddenly worth more structurally than a pound mined elsewhere?
Look at the board. China is happily absorbing vast quantities of Russian enriched materials. They are deeply integrated with Kazakh production, and they own massive African assets.
Right.
But Western utilities, particularly in the U.S. and parts of Europe, are facing increasing political, legal, and reputational restrictions on purchasing Russian fuel or relying heavily on state-owned adversaries.
And again, we're just reporting on the realities of these restrictions as they affect the market, not endorsing any political stance. But thy market impact is undeniable. While China is drinking from every river that feeds the reservoir, the Western utilities are legally restricted to only drinking from a few specific Western-friendly streams.
And those streams are running dry. The Western utilities are trapped. They are forced to fight over an increasingly shrinking pool of politically acceptable non-Russian supply, while the overall global demand floor is being violently pushed upward by the Chinese build-out.
That dynamic places a massive structural premium on any quality asset located in a stable, Western-friendly jurisdiction that can actually deliver physical pounds to the market.
Exactly.
So how do we actually track this? If a listener wants to build a mental dashboard to monitor this structural shift in real time, what are the specific physical metrics they need to watch over the next 12 to 24 months?
Okay, so the first metric on the dashboard is the physical flow of capital into the fuel cycle, specifically Chinese import volumes. We saw the $5.8 billion surge in 2025. Does that trend hold? If we see continued multi-billion-dollar imports targeting EUP and fabricated assemblies, it confirms the stockpiling thesis is still aggressively active.
Got it. We track the cash buying the finished ink. What is the second metric?
Keep a close eye on sovereign M&A activity, new overseas mine deals. Are Chinese state-backed entities actively acquiring more equity stakes in late-stage uranium development projects, particularly in Africa or Central Asia?
Right, because every single physical mine they purchase is another river diverted away from the global reservoir.
Exactly.
We track the cash buying the plantations. And the third metric?
The final metric is the ground truth of the engineering.
Yeah.
The pace of reactor approvals versus actual grid connections. Are they maintaining the rhythm?
Meaning, are the standardizations working?
Yes. If they continue to approve massive multi-unit batches annually, and those 39 reactors currently under construction hit their operational deadlines without major delays, it proves the standardized Hualong 1 manufacturing thesis is actually working.
If the factors are churning out the hardware on schedule, the python is going to keep eating.
It will never stop eating.
We started this deep dive looking at a headline about 8 reactors being approved and an eye-watering investment of over 160 billion RMB. It sounded like an impressive infrastructure flex.
But the concrete is truly just the beginning of the math.
It really is. We discovered that those 8 reactors are simply the latest additions to an expanding pipeline driven by the standardization of nuclear technology. The shift from bespoke custom monuments to a relentless manufacturing assembly line.
Yep.
We tracked a record-breaking $5.8 billion capital flight moving up the value chain to stockpile enriched fuel. We mapped the rule of thirds, showing how Tier 1 global assets are being physically diverted from the open market. And we outlined the irreversible transition from a cyclical boom-and-bust trade to a structural multi-decade bull market defined by a shrinking pool of Western-friendly supply.
It just requires looking past the physical construction and really understanding the molecular and geopolitical realities of the fuel cycle.
It does. And as we close out, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We've spent this time breaking down how China is aggressively and systematically securing roughly 1/3 of its multi-decade fuel needs through the direct ownership of overseas mines, and another third through strategic partnerships, completely bypassing the traditional spot market.
Right.
So, looking at the structural deficit we've mapped out, let me rephrase that without the pause. Looking at the structural deficit we've mapped out, what happens to the massive fleet of Western utilities who are legally bound to keep their grids running when they finally wake up and realize that the open market they have relied on for decades has permanently and irreversibly shrunk?
It is the defining commodity question of the next decade, without a doubt.
It is the math that cannot be ignored. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, true market insight never stops at the headline. You have to look past the concrete and follow the fuel. We'll see you next time.